John, the year 1776 has come up a couple of times in our series.
1776, yes. Important stuff happened that year, capitalism-wise.
I'll say, Adam Smith's big book came out, so did the new and improved James Watt steam engine. But there was one other event worth mentioning.
Yes, there was. And we've explored the American Revolution before on this show, most directly in Season 4, our series on democracy in the U.S. and why we don't have more of it.
The Land That Never Has Been Yet. John, I love that series title for a variety of reasons. It really speaks to me.
I like it too.
And thank you, Langston Hughes. It's a line from his great poem, Let America Be America Again.
You know, when Americans talk about our country's founding, we usually put all the emphasis on that break with the British Crown, the political separation.
America made a vow. Never again would we bow down to a king.
This is President Biden giving a speech in Philadelphia in early 2024. He talked solemnly about the Continental Army and its march to Valley Forge in the icy winter of 1777.
This ragtag army made up of ordinary people, their mission, George Washington declared, was nothing less than a sacred cause. That was the phrase he used, a sacred cause. Freedom, liberty, democracy, American democracy.
But really, for Washington and his peers, was the sacred cause American democracy or American capitalism?
In that Season 4 series with Chenjerai Kumanyika, you pointed out that the United States was not founded as a functioning democracy. Only a small fraction of people, white men with property, were allowed to vote. We wouldn't become a democracy in any full sense for almost 200 years until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And, you know, that makes me wonder what we would be like as a country today if we'd had those voting rights all along.
Very different place. Even today, our democracy is hobbled and deeply flawed. We won't rehash all of that here. We did a whole season on it. Please go listen to Season 4 if you haven't.
The important thing to say here in Season 7 is that when it comes to economics, the American revolutionaries were certainly not looking to head off in a new direction.
Yeah, the founders wanted to cut ties with the bosses back at Imperial headquarters in London, but they fully intended to continue the business ventures that the British Empire had instigated in North America.
Including taking ownership of lands from indigenous people and running agricultural plantations with enslaved African labor. The revolution was not about shutting down any of that. The American founders basically wanted to take the baton from the Brits and run with it themselves.
There's been a century of scholarship now that looks at the American Revolution through an economic lens. Historians saying, essentially, if you want to know why those rich American colonists, and that's who they were, Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, and the rest were some of the richest people in the colonies. If you want to understand why they revolted against the British Crown, look past the lofty language like all men are created equal and follow the money. From the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, this is Scene on Radio, Season 7, Capitalism, Episode 5. I'm John Biewen.
And I'm Ellen McGirt. We're telling the story of the world's dominant economic system and how people shaped it over time. Later in the season, we'll explore ideas about how to remake the system to better serve people and other living things.
In this episode, how the United States became the world's leading capitalist power in the 19th century, and how the explosive growth of profits and wealth under galloping capitalism led to an epic struggle over the spoils, how they should be shared or not.
Of course, that struggle continues to this day. We ended the last episode talking about the fact that capitalism relies on government and an architecture of laws.
It's a political choice.
So now it makes sense to look at the decisions the American revolutionaries made and how those moves reflected their economic vision. John, for season 4, you spoke with the historian Woody Holton, who's written several books on the Revolutionary period. He showed how the British government was stifling the profit-making opportunities of people like Washington and Jefferson, and Holton said those frustrations were decisive in bringing about the big divorce.
Woody Holton of the University of South Carolina, author of Forced Founders, among other books, he points out that in the 1760s, the British government started tightening its economic control in the American colonies.
It's the British that are taking the initiative and trying to change the relationship between the colony and the crown.
Most people know about the new taxes that angered those British subjects in America. The Stamp Act of 1765, the tax on tea that led to the Boston Tea Party in 1773. But before all that, in 1763, the British Parliament issued a proclamation that seriously pissed off some of the American gentry.
The Royal Proclamation of 1763. It prevented land speculators from claiming ownership of native lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Brits were essentially saying to their subjects in North America, stay close to the coast, don't start grabbing land and settling too far inland just yet.
Which seems surprising, right? Because in this case, the British government is blocking the theft and the enclosure, remember that term, of lands in the colonies. At the same time, it's supporting the enclosure movement back home and doing plenty of colonization in India, America, and elsewhere.
Yes, but the Brits did not take this action in 1763 out of concern for the rights of native people. They had just won the long and very costly French and Indian War in North America, and they wanted a break from expensive wars with indigenous tribes. They wanted to pay off their debts from the last war.
That's the same reason they were imposing new taxes in the colonies.
Yes. One member of the colonial elite who was infuriated by the Proclamation of 1763 was a young officer and aggressive land speculator named George Washington. He had plans to claim a big chunk of land in the Ohio Valley. The proclamation froze Washington's effort to claim title to that land.
Interesting. I don't know this George Washington, John. Most of us hear the legend about the cherry tree, but not stuff like this.
Yes.
So, the American elites were getting frustrated with the British government, but still, Woody Holton said, up to about 1774, most of them were not talking revolution. They just wanted the Brits to stop reining in their money-making ventures.
Here's Woody Holton.
At that point, the famous people that we know of from the Revolutionary era, Hancock, Franklin, and Virginia, Jefferson, and Washington, they are protesting the British, but they do not want independence. Really, what they want is conservative. That is, they want to turn back the clock to how things had been in 1763 before Parliament tried to tax them and regulate their trade in ways that it hadn't before and limit their Western expansion. All they want to do is get back to where they were before.
No such luck. Not only did the Brits keep tightening the screws, they then stuck their noses into the colonial slaveholders' business one time too many, Woody says. When it looked like there might be war between the British and the Americans, British loyalists made a move to get the support of enslaved black people. The royal governor of the colony of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, promised freedom for black people if they'd run away from their owners and enlist on the British side.
And some did. 1,000 or 2,000 black men escaped from their plantations and joined British forces.
This enraged some slaveholding colonists. Most importantly, Thomas Jefferson.
See, I'm a little more familiar with this Thomas Jefferson, but it is still an interesting reframing of his story. People like Jefferson became revolutionaries not because they wanted to create a dramatically more democratic country or any such thing, Holton says, but because they wanted to carry on with, and let's just say it, their exploitative, colonial, white supremacist business ventures without all that interference from across the pond.
Trying to understand the mind of this paradoxical figure, the elite revolutionary, if you really forced me, which I'd rather not be forced to to put the motives of the American Revolution into a single phrase, it would be resistance to British meddling. General meddling, but meddling in those relationships, especially relationships between the gentry and the slaves, and earlier than that, the gentry relationship with Native Americans.
It's not just the decision to declare independence. The choices the founders made after independence made an even louder statement about the kind of economic power they wanted to build.
All right, John, you're our reporter. Take us through the first century plus of American capitalism, and then we'll talk a bit more.
See you soon. As we said, historians have found it useful to follow the money as a way to understand the American Revolution, and not just this country's preferred story about a young, scrappy, and hungry people demanding self-government. Experts make a parallel point about the U.S. Constitution, the nation's legal blueprint, and why the founders felt the need to create that document in the 1780s.
You know, I like to torture my students sometimes by putting up, by asking them, what are your favorite phrases in the Constitution? And all the blackboard says is, United States Constitution, September 17, 1787. What are your favorite phrases in that document?
It's a trick question. Without fail, Woody says, most of the students' answers, if they don't actually refer to the Declaration of Independence, refer to the Bill of Rights, which was not part of the original Constitution that the framers hashed out in 1787. Those 10 amendments were added later under pressure and not ratified until 1791. So, if the 55 men at the Constitutional Convention didn't spend that summer in Philadelphia discussing freedom of speech and the right to bear arms, what were they talking about, those rich merchants, lawyers, and slaveholding planters? A whole lot of the debate had economic ramifications. Echoing the Enlightenment thinker John Locke, framers like Gouverneur Morris, a wealthy landowner from New York, put the protection of private property at the center of the national project.
An accurate view of the matter would prove that property is the main object of society.
For almost half of the convention delegates, the slaveholders, property meant people. The framers infamously reached compromises to ensure that slavery would remain legal and gave disproportionate power to the slave states so their delegates wouldn't stomp out of the convention. There was talk about class and the fact that the wealthy, represented by the men in the room, would always be far outnumbered by the poor working classes. In those days, the vast majority were farmers.
All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born, the other, the mass of the people.
Those are the words of Alexander Hamilton. He and others said, without blushing, that the Constitution needed to protect the interests of the rich and well-born and the national well-being by throttling the power of the working-class majority, which they did by putting up a stiff series of hurdles that any law coming out of the House of Representatives, the People's House, would have to clear: the Senate, the presidential veto, and the courts. The framers were making sure the new national government would not behave like the state governments under the country's first arrangement, the Articles of Confederation. Most states in the 1780s held elections every year and put few checks on their legislatures. This made state lawmakers highly responsive to the wishes of ordinary white male people, tax-paying farmers. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts said this at the Constitutional Convention.
The evils we experience flow from the excess of democracy.
So it didn't include a Bill of Rights, but the first cut of the Constitution did have a section taking away the state's power to print money and to pass laws that affect business contracts or international trade. It gave those powers to the federal government. Woody Holton says if you read the Constitution carefully and the debate around it, the framers' number one priority comes through loud and clear: attracting and facilitating the movement of capital.
The authors of the Constitution believed that in order to make America safe for investment, they had to make America less democratic. They really believed that there's a a continuum or spectrum between if you move the needle towards more democracy, you're going to get less investment capital, and if you move it towards less democracy, you're going to get more investment capital.
The elite founders of this country were skeptical at best about the idea of a democratic United States, but they knew they wanted to outfit their new nation to step boldly into the surging capitalist order. In just a few generations, the U.S. would overtake its parent as the leader of that world system. Historians usually place the start of the Industrial Revolution at around 1760 in England, with the increasing use of machines powered by water wheels and steam. The fledgling United States, a few decades later, had catching up to do.
So, do you want to talk about pre-industrial life at all?
Well, I tell you what, yeah, let's... In Pawtucket, Rhode Island a few years ago, for season 4, I visited the old Slater Mill historic site. Interpreter Robin Alario showed me around and described life along the Blackstone River before the mill opened. We
had a shipbuilding industry, we had ironworks industry, and we had a rum brewing economy. Everyone else was pretty much a farmer. And
that changed with the arrival of a man named Sam Slater in 1790.
We had into the textile mill,
who brought with him from England the design of a cutting-edge machine.
So we have a wooden replica of one of the first cotton spinning machines known as the Arkwright water frame. This is the whole reason we're here. This is the machine.
Slater Mill started operating in 1793, turning bales of cotton into thread. Its machines powered by the flow of the Blackstone River. Because of this mill, Pawtucket claims this title.
The birthplace of the Industrial Revolution.
That is, in the U.S.
Because this is the first successful water-powered cotton spinning mill here in the United States. There were others.
Also in 1793, Eli Whitney patented the first cotton gin, which mechanized the labor-intensive process of pulling seeds out of cotton bolls. Whitney's machine made it much quicker and easier to prepare raw cotton for processing at a mill like this one.
That same year he filed his patent was the same year this mill opened for business. Samuel Slater became very successful with that cotton mill, and everybody realized this was the new big thing.
These new technologies uncorked an industry, finally allowing the makers of cotton cloth to meet the global demand with ample supply. Textile mills sprouted across New England. Under British rule, the American colonies had been a source of raw commodities for the empire, like India. Cotton grown in the American South was shipped across the sea for processing in places like Manchester. Now a lot of that cloth production could stay at home. This powered a new American manufacturing economy, and with the money that people earned in those mills, mostly white immigrants, a budding consumer economy too. But let's not forget the foundation on which this industry stood: the unpaid labor of enslaved black people.
Slavery, especially cotton slavery, and the expansion of cotton slavery drove that sort of post-colonial economy from being something of a backwater to being one of the most, and by the end of the 19th century, the absolutely most important economy, something that is at that point new in world history, a global capitalist economy, a global capitalist industrial economy. And slavery in the U.S. South is central to all of that.
Historian Edward Baptist of Cornell University, author of The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. He says in the first half of the 19th century, cotton became the world's most traded and most valuable commodity, much like oil in today's world. It's easy to see why the United States had an advantage over its competitors across the Atlantic. The Europeans had mills, but they had to import cotton. The U.S. now had its own mills and its own land for cotton fields, which the new nation got busy expanding and expanding. Americans hear a lot about the nation's westward expansion, those wagon trains rumbling across the prairie to Oregon and California. But before that, the United States pushed its frontier into the Old Southwest, what we now call the Southeast. Of the 13 original states, only South Carolina and Georgia were in prime cotton-growing territory. Seeing a chance to build a cotton empire, U.S. leaders moved aggressively into what would become Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and eventually Texas. Remind us of the steps that are needed. First of all, you got to take the land.
Yep. First of all, you have to take the land. And
that meant, for one thing, cutting deals with the European empires that still made claims to that land, France and Spain, the giant Louisiana Purchase of 1803, and the annexing of Mississippi Territory, the future states of Mississippi and Alabama, in 1804.
And above all, you have the native peoples themselves.
The Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole peoples who lived on their lands across what is now the southeastern United States.
The U.S. gradually defeats and pushes out all of them in a series of wars and forced treaties, let's say. The states of Tennessee and Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Texas, and Louisiana are swarmed with a huge number of white settlers who bring ultimately what becomes a population of about 2 million enslaved African Americans in those states by the 1850s.
Ed Baptist says the new white owners of that southern land first put black people to work cutting down forests, then growing and picking cotton.
You have the transformation of a subcontinental-sized area from woods and subsistence production by native peoples into a massive commercial agricultural complex. And of course, there's still woods at the end of that process, but there's a lot less woods and there's a lot more cotton fields.
By the time of the Civil War, the Southern American states were not only producing plenty of cotton for the nation's mills in New England, they'd made the U.S. the world's dominant cotton producer.
Those states by the 1850s are producing something like 88 to 95%, depends on the year, of the cotton that is sold in Liverpool, which is the world's biggest cotton market.
Wow. Between 1800 and 1860, cotton production in the U.S. multiplied 500-fold, from 4 million pounds a year to 2 billion. King Cotton, more than any other single industry, made the U.S. an important economic power just decades after independence. The country's even more explosive rise in the last half of the 19th century is more familiar. Told in a certain way, it's another cherished part of the national story.
America's growth following the Civil War is nothing short of epic. Train tracks link east to west as never before. Oil lights homes from coast to coast. And steel is remaking the landscape in a way never thought possible.
That's from the History Channel miniseries, The Men Who Built America. The series, aired in 2012, tells stories of men like Vanderbilt, Morgan, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Ford, and the industries they led: shipping, steel and railroads, oil, electricity, automobiles.
They were the ones that set the standard for the American dream. They owned a new frontier, literally and figuratively, of who we are as a culture.
The series lionizes these capitalists. At the same time, it demonstrates their ruthlessness.
The only rule was there were no rules. Whatever it took to put your competition out of business, they were going to try to do it.
If they want a war, I'll give them a war.
One episode shows how, in 1867, Cornelius Vanderbilt crushed his railroad competitors.
Vanderbilt owns the only rail bridge into New York City. It's the gateway to the country's largest port, supplying the entire continent. Vanderbilt knows this is the hammer he needs to beat his rivals into submission.
Vanderbilt closes his privately owned bridge across the Hudson River to any trains that he doesn't own, blocking access to New York and throwing his competitors into crisis. When their stock plunges, he buys it up.
In just days, Vanderbilt takes control of the rival railroad, creating the largest single rail company in America.
There's a reason these guys were called robber barons. The term came into regular use after 1870. Their aggressiveness extended to their treatment of the natural world and their workers.
Like business owners all over the country, Carnegie did not care to be dictated to by his hired hands.
This is from another documentary, Gilded Age, from the PBS series American Experience. It tells the story of Carnegie's move in 1892 to break the Union at Homestead, his flagship steel plant near Pittsburgh.
Carnegie had given his right-hand man, Henry Clay Frick, clear instructions. Demand a sizable wage cut at Homestead and refuse to negotiate. We all approve of anything you do, Carnegie wrote from 3,000 miles away. We are with you to the end.
When Homestead's workers went on strike, Frick brought in replacement workers and the Pinkertons, a private security force.
At least 16 people were killed and more than 150 injured in the battle that followed.
The swiftly rising economic tide did lift many boats. Average working-class wages rose during the late 1800s. But the Gilded Age was known for extreme inequality and shameless consumption by the rich. Historians Steve Fraser and Nell Irvin Painter in the PBS program.
It's shocking for people to see a country developing before them that is increasingly clearly divided into the haves and have-nots.
Gilded is not golden. Gilded has the sense of a patina covering something else. It's the shiny exterior and the rot underneath.
Mainstream American accounts of the late 19th century often embrace the great man theory of history. The Men Who Built America, the History Channel series, shows the titans of capitalism like Vanderbilt and Rockefeller as giants in silhouette, striding in slow motion across the landscape. Here's a certain, at the time, future president, featured in that series as an authority on American business.
These were great men with a vision that nobody else had. And that's why in the last century, that 50-year period, we built the world.
But those 19th century tycoons were riding a historical wave, the convergence of forces that sparked the Second Industrial Revolution on both sides of the Atlantic, an age of rapid scientific discovery, invention, and mass production. Hello, Brad.
Hello, how are you?
I spoke with economic historian Brad DeLong of the University of California, Berkeley. He makes a case that human history, after 200,000 or 300,000 years, entered an entirely new stage around 1870.
You try to guess at what the actual rate of improvement of technology is. And we look around us today and we see that since 1870 worldwide, it's kind of 2% per year, that every year we can make what we made last year 2% more cheaply. And so we have, 2% more resources per person available to make other things and to discover and invent other things.
2% doesn't sound like a big number until you consider it's a 2% increase in material capacity every year. DeLong says that's about 5 times the rate of advancement in the century before 1870, 10 times the rate during the several centuries before that, and maybe 50 times faster than humanity's progress before the year 1500.
That is, we get more technological progress in 1 year than they got in a generation back before 1500. And we get more progress in 1 year than they got in a decade, between 1500 and 1770. And that's been more or less the rule since 1870.
Brad DeLong's big book, Slouching Towards Utopia, was published in 2022. It's an economic history of what he calls the long 20th century, from 1870 to 2010. He argues that period is the most consequential in human history, a sudden spurt in which humans made as much progress in collective wealth and technological prowess as in the previous 8,000 years. But DeLong's book is more of a lament than a celebration. We'll get to that in a minute. First, more on the claim he's making about that 140-year period. So, how were things in 1870?
Well, they're still pretty bad.
DeLong quotes the British philosopher John Stuart Mill, who wrote in the early 1870s that all the technological discoveries up to that moment had only allowed a greater population to live the same life of drudgery and imprisonment.
All the mechanical inventions of the Industrial Revolution, all of the steam engines and the railroads and the automatic textile machinery and the forges and the furnaces and the kilns, that all of those had simply made the fortunes of plutocrats and had enabled a middle class, a relatively small middle class, to be larger and live a life of more conveniences. But the overwhelming bulk of the people were still in the same life of drudgery and imprisonment. And note the word imprisonment, right? That John Stuart Mill does not see a real difference between being, completely unfree, being in jail, and being so hag-ridden by necessity. And in dire poverty that you have little time other than go to your job, work, consume your 2,000 calories plus essential nutrients a day, and then go to sleep because you're exhausted, and then start it all over again on the following day.
Ellen and I talked about this earlier in the series, that in the first 3.5 centuries of its life on the main stage, capitalism created little, if any, improvement in the lives of most people, even in the richest commercial societies. DeLong says that's true not only because people in the ownership class hoarded the profits, though they did, but also because economic growth between the 1500s and 1870 was still too slow to outrun a growing population. It's that problem that the British thinker Thomas Malthus described at the end of the 18th century.
Humans are naturally very, very fertile.
People made more children than the land could comfortably feed, even as farms did gradually get more productive. Malthus thought sexual abstinence was the only way out of this conundrum. He was wrong.
It's only after 1870 that productivity growth becomes fast enough that there's no way that human fecundity can keep up with it. There's no way the population explosion can keep living standards from rising.
DeLong shares a stunning statistic. In 1600, the average wage of a working man in London could buy just the bare necessity, 2,000 calories a day for the worker and his family. By 1870, things were a little better. That worker could buy 5,000 calories for everyone in his household, leaving a little left over after they'd fed themselves. By 2010, the average wage of a London worker could buy the equivalent of 2.4 million calories a day. Meaning, of course, that after paying for the essentials, that family could also buy a car and a house full of gadgets, get tickets to the occasional soccer match or concert, take a vacation once a year, and maybe save something for retirement. What changed to put humanity, or some of humanity, on this path to abundance?
What you really need is you need for 1870 to come, and for 1870 to bring with it, the ocean-going screw-propellered steamship, the full build-out of the railroad network, the full build-out of the telegraph network, globalization, the creation of a global economy. And you need the industrial research lab, so it's not just individual inventors thinking of things and then trying to scramble to put together an organization, but rather you rationalize and routinize and so revolutionize the process of technological development.
It's because of the Industrial Research Lab, he says, that guys like Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla weren't just scientists tinkering in their own labs. Backed by corporate investors like J.P. Morgan and Westinghouse, they became inventors of world-changing technologies.
And you also, I think, really do need the modern corporation. You know, big corporations are good at taking some idea and putting it to work not in one factory, but in 100 factories all over the world. And they're also very good at looking at their neighboring corporations and saying, we should be doing that too.
Put it all together. Breakneck scientific progress, capital investment, mass production, and fierce competition. And suddenly, starting just 150 years ago, humanity's material capacity started doubling every generation. A new thing in human history. And yet, here's Brad DeLong reading from the conclusion of his book, Slouching Towards Utopia.
Okay. Is there anybody in any previous century who would not be amazed and incredulous at seeing humanity's technological and organizational powers as of 2010? Yet they would then go on to ask the next question. Why, with such godlike powers to command nature and organize ourselves, have we done so little to build a truly human world to approach within sight of any of our utopias?
Ellen, we'll hear more about what Brad DeLong means over the next episode or two. But we kind of know what he's talking about, don't we?
I think we do. He's saying that over the last century and a half, humanity took huge steps toward solving what seemed to be our greatest material challenge: how to build a big enough economic pie so everyone could live a decent life. But then we found we had another problem, and we have not solved it.
And that is how to share our collective wealth so that, as DeLong puts it, borrowing a phrase from the great British economist John Maynard Keynes, so that we could all live wisely and well. But to back up a bit into the episode, Ellen, you are a longtime business reporter. We Americans do like to make heroes of our captains of industry, don't we?
We do. And you know, I'm pretty sure it hasn't served us very well. We love them, envy them, hate them. We put their names on important buildings and their faces on magazine covers. Back then, it was Vanderbilt and Rockefeller. Now it's Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos, and of course, Steve Jobs. But I have some beef with that History Channel series, starting with its title.
The Men Who Built America.
You know what I'm going to say. Those men, the J.P. Morgans, Fords, and so on, they elbowed their way to the top, and I'll give them this. They came up with winning strategies that created wealth and put lots of people to work. But they did not build the United States of America. Many millions of people did that, mostly with their bare hands. And most of those workers were paid paltry sums for their labor, and millions were paid nothing at all.
Yes. Now, this idea that you've just raised is pretty basic, or it should be, but I'm with you. I think it's important to spell it out and dwell on it for just a minute.
Yeah.
And in fact, I'd like to broaden the frame a little bit more and put the question this way. As capitalist societies ramped up the accumulation of wealth, especially with the Second Industrial Revolution, where did those mountains of wealth come from? Since, nothing comes from nothing.
When people say capitalism generates wealth, there's this tendency to talk as if the money just spins up out of thin air. It just materializes because Henry Ford or Steve Jobs had a brilliant idea. And that's just not how it works. The people who own businesses and own capital, they gain, well, let's use the word extract because it's more accurate. They extract profit from somewhere.
Now, to be clear, we're not saying it's a zero-sum proposition that there's a fixed amount of wealth in the world and any money that one person makes is money subtracted from somebody else. That was the idea behind mercantilism 400 years ago. There's only so much wealth on the planet. Let's go get as much of it as we can by any means necessary. That's not what we mean here.
Right. New wealth does get introduced into the world through capitalist investment and production. But there's still a fundamental sense in which that wealth has to come from somewhere. And it's mainly from labor and from the earth. So let's go back to the ground you've just covered, the first century or so of U.S. history. Although, John, really the story starts earlier.
Yes, even earlier than 1619 and the beginning of slavery in what would become the United States. It starts before that with the land and everything the land makes possible. There is no USA, no cotton empire, no agricultural powerhouse, no lumber, railroads, no oil fields without this vast and abundant land.
Which the colonizers took by genocidal force and deception from the people who belonged to this land for thousands of years. So, in an undeniable sense, the wealth that resulted from the exploitation of this land, in particular, was stolen.
A whole lot of the wealth that built this country was stolen in another way, too.
Yes, yes. From the enslaved Black people who provided, against their will, absolutely pivotal labor in the construction of the U.S. as an economic power.
Researchers have estimated that a total of 10 million African people lived their lives as chattel in colonial America and the United States between 1619 and 1865. And those people contributed, are you ready, over 400 billion hours of unpaid labor.
I was not ready, John. I was not ready. You know, my last name is a slave name, which I bring up more often than I probably should. But some of those people were my ancestors.
This is a colossal fact that most of us, white Americans, have not begun to get our minds around or to acknowledge, let alone getting serious about making good on that unpaid debt.
But of course, the extraction of profit from labor isn't limited to enslaved labor. Business owners make money by selling their products for more than it costs to produce them. That's elementary economics. But to make that work, employers pay their workers less than the value of their labor.
That basic dynamic goes to the heart of battles between workers and their employers over centuries now. What's a fair wage? How much profit is enough? Who has any say in the matter? How can workers get leverage, for example, through collective bargaining, to demand a bigger share of the pie? But back to the U.S. and its growing economic might in the 19th century and where that wealth came from, besides the land, think of all the workers.
The construction of the railroads, which accelerated economic growth, required the labor of hundreds of thousands of people over decades. Those workers came from all over the world. In the Western U.S., the majority were Chinese immigrants, recruited to this country specifically to do that job, because white men were not applying in big enough numbers.
I looked up their pay. Chinese rail workers in California in the 1860s, working 6 days a week, were paid an average of $26 a month, according to an estimate from Stanford University. That's less than $6,000 a year in today's money.
No wonder those rail companies had to go across the Pacific to a much poorer country to find workers. We could go on, though, through different industries. The workers in those textile mills, in the shipyards, the mines, the steel mills, the oil fields, on farms all over the country, in garment factories. Come again? Who built the wealth of the United States?
I gotta add this footnote about the railroads, though it's not really a footnote, it's pretty dang important. The U.S. government, having taken land from indigenous tribes, made land grants of millions and millions of acres to the railroad companies in the 1850s to 1870s, so they could build those rail lines.
Oh, hang on. So it wasn't just private enterprise all by itself? Government investment played a part? Just as the federal government also had something to do with the internet and the iPhone? But there we go again, John, getting ahead of ourselves.
Yes. During the stretch we've covered in this episode, the 19th century, the class struggle we're familiar with as a feature of a capitalist world was ongoing, with quite a few bursts of conflict and violence. People also adopted a lot of the language we use today.
In fact, the word capitalism itself finally came into regular use in the mid-1800s. The words capital and capitalist had been around for hundreds of years, but it wasn't until 1850 that a Frenchman, Louis Blanc, introduced the ism, capitalism.
So it wasn't Adam Smith and it wasn't Karl Marx, though Louis Blanc, like Marx, was a socialist and a critic of capitalism. The word socialism, by the way, was coined earlier in the 1830s in France.
But more important than the words people used, to circle back to the point, the struggles between the classes in a capitalist system, the people who own businesses and the people who earn a wage working for them, those struggles were always there.
In the U.S., the battles intensified as the country moved through the Second Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age. This was the time of sweatshops, 12 and even 16-hour days, 6 days a week, child labor, that whole terrible Dickensian reality, here and across the pond.
Please, sir, I want some more. More?
There were hardly any laws to protect workers from grossly exploitative and dangerous working conditions, no laws against monopolies or corporate collusion, no taxes on inheritances, personal income, or corporate profits.
So energy was building on the side of working people, directed against the people at the top who had most of the money and the power. We heard about the strike and the killings at the Homestead Steel Factory in 1892. That was just one of many battles between workers and their bosses.
To mention a couple more, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, also called the Great Upheaval, up to 100,000 workers went on strike from New York to Missouri to protest wages that were low and going lower. About 100 people died in violence between strikers and, on the other side, federal and National Guard troops and private militias that the railroad companies hired.
Here's one more. In 1886, labor groups planned a general strike from May 1st to call for an 8-hour workday. Several 100,000 workers across the country took part. In Chicago on May 4th, a peaceful demonstration at Haymarket Square turned violent. When police tried to disperse the protesters, someone tossed a bomb. Then police opened fire, starting a shootout. At least 7 policemen and 4 demonstrators were killed.
3 years later, an international federation of socialist and labor groups designated May 1st as a day to honor workers. They referenced Haymarket in choosing the date. In 1894, with another major strike going on, involving workers with the Pullman Rail Car Company, Congress made Labor Day a national holiday, though in September, not May. President Grover Cleveland signed that bill. Historians say he felt he needed to placate a working class that was increasingly angry and active.
All of which brings us to the Progressive Era, the period from about 1890 to 1920. It was a time when growing pressure for economic, social, and political reform was having an effect. Real change did come. At least some change. And that's where we pick up the story in episode 6.
Next time, the 20th century, including the 30 glorious years. This episode was made by me with Ellen McGirt and our story editor, Loretta Williams. Music by Michelle Osis, Alex Simcox, Goodnight Lucas, and Lily Hayden. Music consulting by Joe Augustine of Narrative Music. Voiceovers this time by Lawrence Baldine, Dan Partridge, and Bill Bamberger. Production help from Brianna Breen. Our website is scenonradio.org. We post transcripts there. This season is produced in partnership with Imperative 21. The show is distributed by our friends at PRX. Scene on Radio comes to you from the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University.